our competitors are only the ones selling exactly the same thing as us. That is absolutely not true, and I'm going to talk you through why that is. Hello and welcome to Engage and Thrive, also known as EAT, your coffee catch-up with me, your host, Taelon, where we will go through common problems and hurdles that come up in business, marketing and advertising and try and demystify them. I know firsthand how complicated and confusing it can seem with all the different acronyms and all the things to do in business. So let me try and help you be better in business. First things first, let's start with grabbing a coffee. Right, to straight up myth bust this, to assume that competitors are only the ones that sound and look like you, aka selling the same product or services you do, is actually quite dangerous. The reality is nowadays we're all competing with people's attention span, their budget, their trust, their loyalty. There's like so many things that come into play when someone's making a decision to physically buy, to physically purchase. The other thing is, if you're having that one-dimension view about who your competitors are, you're potentially missing out in massive gaps in your positioning and how you actually speak to your audience, and potentially even your pricing points. As always, let's go through vocab. The first one being direct competitors. So these are people selling the same product or service to the same audience as you. Indirect competitors. So they solve the same problem, but in a different way. Substitutes, an alternative solution, potentially in a different category or industry to you. Dark horse, a new or emerging player that no one expected. SWOT analysis, so this is a quadrant of 4 standing for strength, weakness, opportunity and threat. PESTLE analysis, another analysis tool that's standing for political, economical, social, technological, legal and environmental. Number 1, knowing the types of competitors. So like I mentioned in the myth bust, it's not always what it might seem, or it doesn't always have to be direct competitors who are your competitors. And we've covered off previously about the assumption of not having competitors, and we all have competitors. Doesn't matter what you do, everyone has competitors. So of course, direct competitors are same audience, same offer. Give you some real life examples: McDonald's versus Burger King, Uber versus Lyft versus Bolt versus Grab, Nike versus Adidas, Starbucks versus Costa. I think these are all relatively simple in terms of what is a direct competitor. Now, an indirect competitor would be a different offer but the same problem. So the same industry or adjacent but an alternative method. To give you some examples: Uber versus public transport, Starbucks versus Nespresso at-home coffee machines. And a substitute is potentially from a completely different industry but solves the same need. So I don't just literally mean pork versus tofu, a meat alternative, the likes of gym membership versus YouTube workout channels, owning a car versus a subscription service, hiring a virtual assistant versus using AI tools. Now, the reason why I wanted to clarify those up front about direct, indirect and substitute is because you need to be thinking about this when you're trying to understand types of competition. There's a few questions you would want to ask yourself. For example, where would someone go if your website went down? Okay, and you might say, okay, well, they'll just go to social media. But let's, for this example, imagine that your brand disappeared from the digital ecosystem. Okay, where would people go? What would they look for? What is their need and desire at that point in time that they would then do? Who would they look for, or what words would they be looking for, or what alternatives do they have in mind? So like with the example, if I was hungry and I wanted McDonald's and I couldn't get McDonald's, I would just go for another alternative to fulfill my hunger. With that same thought trail of where would people go if your website went down or your social channels disappeared, you also have to think about that with response times. So if people are actually reaching out to brands to find alternatives or benchmarking competition or comparing you in the industry, so if you had software, for example, and they're trying to understand different software, you have to also think about response times, because if you're not responding to someone, it's as good as your website being down or your social media is not existing, because by the time you potentially respond, they've already moved on, they've already got their answer, they've already made a decision. As I mentioned in the myth bust, with the reality of attention span nowadays, we're actually all competing for that attention span. So I know it sounds really drastic, me saying about having your response times, and that can impact if someone actually picked a competitor, but that is a reality. You have to be there and then at that point in time for someone to make that decision. Now, there are situations where people are just browsing around and may not buy because they're happy with what they've got right now and they're just looking at what's on the market. But you want to be at the forefront of their decision of comparing to what they have right now and hopefully persuading them to move from what they have right now, which means you're not only competing for sales, you're competing for visibility. You want to be there in their face when they're even considering browsing other options. The other competitor that exists, which is something that no one can really plan for, is the dark horses. So these are the businesses that come into the market and disrupt everything, and no one expects them, and you can't even plan for them. Well, we'll go into further in takeaway 2 about how you can try and keep your finger on the pulse. But the likes of these are Shein. Okay, so Shein seemed to appear from nowhere and took on big fashion giants. The same with Temu. Think of the downloads of people downloading the Temu app. Another one is Canva. Who would have thought a free drag and drop design software would take on the likes of Adobe? Another one was Duolingo, actually taking on language schools. So an offline experience being challenged by an online experience, and an online experience making learning languages fun and gamification. Completely unexpected. Which nicely leads into number 2, how to analyze competition. Now, I'm not trying to overwhelm you about how many different types there are of competition, but the point is that there is probably more than you think, and it's worthwhile to keep your finger on the pulse of thinking about indirect competition and substitutes and potential dark horses, because the reality is you can use that to your advantage. But I'm fully aware this potentially could come up with a massive list for you of like 50 competitors that you need to monitor, and the reality is you're never going to have the time to monitor all of them, so you do need to cut it down and be realistic about who you want to monitor. This is when you would use tools like a SWOT analysis and a PESTLE analysis to actually work out who are the competitors that you want to monitor. So if we use the example of the SWOT analysis with strength, weakness, opportunity and threat, do this for your business and then do it for their business. Think about who is a threat to your business. Who is it that when your website is down or when you're slow to respond on social media, where else are people going to go? Who is the substitute? So not your direct competition, but who is your substitute? Still fulfilling that need for your customer. Now I need you to become obsessed with your competitors. And the reason for saying that is because you want to know everything about them. You want to know all their marketing strategy, all their branding strategy, because again, you can leverage that for your business and your brand. So to give you an example, I normally sign up to competitors' newsletters, I follow them on social media, I even enable the notification alerts for when they're posting. I regularly check their websites, I add them in on all the dashboards where I can for ranking them against us. You know, like if you think of a Facebook page, if you go into the settings of your Facebook page, you can actually add in competitors on your Facebook page. I believe it's up to 20. And then if you're using other tools to monitor, like SEMrush, you can add in competitors, typically up to 5. And then free tools like Google Alerts. You can set up Google Alerts for your competitor name, brand, their product or service, the key people in their business. Again, this is a way of seeing campaigns that they're releasing, seeing press releases, the good, the bad and the ugly, everything about your competitors. But you really want to study them. You want to look at their customer experience, their messaging, their positioning, their color palettes, their tone, how quick they're responding to social media messages. Are they using out of hour responses? Are they using ManyChat to actually engage? What are their case studies? What are their downloadables like? Everything about them you want to know. And you essentially want to benchmark where you are against them. And like I said, this is not just direct competitors or even indirect competitors, this is also substitute competitors. Because again, you have to keep going back to, you are competing for visibility and attention and trust and loyalty with your audience. So if you didn't exist, if everything went down, what would they pick as an alternative? Other ways of analyzing competitors, and especially with substitutes, is obviously doing the good old Google search. So Google search for words and phrases around your products or services. Think like your target customer, what would they be Googling to come up with alternatives if your product or service didn't exist, or they weren't able to access your website or your social medias. Again, also think about now, with the age of things changing, typing into Google Gemini or ChatGPT, asking those questions. Obviously, make sure you're not logged in, because it would have stored your data about your business or your brand, and you want to be doing the same experience for your target customer. Now, there's obviously a lot to track and monitor, and especially if you're reviewing customer experience and, like I said, getting in bed with your competitors. So the reality is, it's down to your business and industry as and when you would do these updates and analysis. But realistically, you want to be reviewing this like once a quarter. But actually, sometimes you may want to put some competitive benchmarking on monthly reports, just to know where you are, how you're tracking, who's overtaking who's got higher visibility at the moment. Number 3, use insights to win. So I would say there are industries that do this really, really well, typically in the software space, and especially B2B, because people normally want to do like-for-like comparisons for software and quick, easy table. Who has what features, how much does it cost, etc. But actually, if you use that thought trail for anything to do with your competitors, direct, indirect, and substitutes, it's a great way of thinking. You can actually use those comparisons in your marketing collateral. So your email communication, obviously your website copy, your social media. Again, are there other brands or substitutes that your target audience are more familiar with, especially a new audience that you don't have yet, that you can use as a quick win comparison? So by having all this analysis of your competitors, it just strengthens your unique selling points, it strengthens your positioning, it strengthens, I suppose, even your tone, because you're really owning that space of understanding your industry or understanding how you compare to even the substitutes. You can also use the insights from your competitors to refine your offering. You can think about your pricing, you can think about your returns policy, you could be thinking about your customer servicing. There's so many things to consider, and actually, how can you build on that as a business? Because again, going back to, we're all competing on visibility, attention span, trust, loyalty. So everything you can find out about your competitors, use it as, what can you do better? What can you learn that they're doing that you can tweak and make it better for your business? And this is where people also talk about a phrase about building your moat. So this is really around building your community, building your trust and loyalty with your audience so strong around your brand. If you imagine a moat around a castle in the middle, that people won't even be thinking about other competitors or substitutes because they are so loyal to your brand. But this is really where your target audience desire your product so much that they would rather wait. If you were sold out, they would wait. They would get on a waiting list. If you have a new product launch, they're signing up. They're wanting to know the next drop you've got coming. If you went down, that's fine. They're not going to look for anything else. They're just going to wait for you to come back online. If you were closed for public holidays, doesn't matter. They're not going to go anywhere else. They're going to wait to have the experience with you. This is really the ultimate. This is kind of like a unicorn moment when you have this strong moat around your brand and such a strong community. But I would say it's really hard to get to that. Having this said moat is obviously really special and really unique, and likely more happening in niche markets with really strong target demographics. Doesn't mean it can't be achieved. It just means it takes a lot of work to get there. And the likelihood is, if you have this moat, you have definitely got your finger on the pulse of what your competitors are doing, because you're just building up stronger and stronger, keeping everyone in your community, keeping everyone wanting more from you only. As a wrap up, hopefully I've explained how competitors are not just the ones that look like you, and you do need to be thinking about those substitutes, because those are the sneaky ones. Those are probably the ones that you least expect, but could get your target audience very easy and very quickly, especially if you're taking a long time to respond to emails or respond to social media messages. You've potentially turned them off completely as an industry, and they will go to a different industry or different category because they think you're just like the other brands. The same thing being said is, they may have had a bad experience from someone else, one of your direct competitors or indirect competitors. So you need to make your experience even better to get their attention. And remember, keeping your finger on your pulse of your competitors is a good thing. Use it to your advantage and continue to do it. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Engage and Thrive with your host Taelon, and see you next week.